Weddings are meant to mark new beginnings, but in these moments, they became scenes of irreversible horror, captured on phones, security cameras, and raw audio. These ceremonies spiraled into chaos in seconds. No reenactments, no second chances, just real celebrations that ended in silence. It was early evening at an indoor wedding reception held in a mid-sized banquet hall. Rows of round tables filled the room, and soft music played through ceiling speakers. Overhead, metal trusses supported lighting and decorative elements that had been installed earlier in the day. Guests finished dinner and shifted their chairs toward the open dance floor as staff prepared for the cake cutting. The bride, Jane Mitchells, was 28 years old. She worked an administrative office job and had planned most of the wedding herself to stay within budget. She and her husband, Dwayne Mitchells, age 31, chose a simple reception package offered by the venue. The guest list was limited to family and close friends. Jane had no public profile and did not seek attention beyond the event itself. One feature included in the package was a grand cake reveal, where the wedding cake would be lowered from above for photographs. The cake was oversized and multi-tiered, mounted on a metal tray attached to a single cable system. The tray was connected to a winch hidden above the ceiling decor, positioned directly over the dance floor. The rig was decorative and had been installed earlier that afternoon by event staff. There was no visible backup cable or secondary safety line supporting the tray. As staff transitioned the reception to the cake-cutting portion, guests stood and gathered closer to the dance floor. Phones were raised to record. Children were moved back toward the tables. Jane and Dwayne were guided into position directly beneath the cake's descent path, standing side by side and facing the cameras as the cake began to lower. At first, the cake moved down slowly. Several guests noticed it pause briefly in midair. The tray swayed slightly before settling. Music continued playing, and no one stepped away from the area. The lowering resumed, bringing the cake closer to head level. As the cake descended the final few feet, the winch slipped. The cable suddenly released tension. Multiple guests later reported hearing a sharp metallic snap, followed immediately by a heavy drop. Several phones captured the moment as the cake fell straight down from above. The cake in its metal frame dropped freely. The combined weight of the cake and metal tray, estimated at over 150 pounds, dropped straight down, striking Jane Mitchells on the head and upper neck. The force was immediate and overwhelming. She collapsed where she stood and did not move. Guests nearest the impact stepped backward. The cake broke apart across the floor, spreading layers and frosting outward. The metal tray twisted on impact. The loose cable hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly above the scene. No one beneath the rig remained standing. The frame came to rest partly across Jane's shoulders and upper body. She remained motionless. Staff moved toward the area but stopped when they saw damage to the ceiling mount and the unstable rig overhead. Efforts to clear the space halted as people realized the structure above was no longer secure. Jane Mitchells died on the reception floor where the cake fell. Dwayne Mitchells remained beside the collapsed display as staff and guests cleared space around them. The cause of death was later determined to be fatal head and cervical trauma caused by a falling suspended object. The wedding ended inside the banquet hall, with guests standing quietly beneath the damaged rig, parts of the cake display still hanging from the ceiling where the celebration had been moments earlier. It was August 3rd, 2015, in Corolla, North Carolina, during the late afternoon hours after a beachside wedding ceremony. The sky was overcast, and steady winds pushed waves toward shore. Recent storms had altered the shoreline, leaving uneven sandbars and sudden drop-offs just beyond the waterline. The ceremony for Nicole Phillips, 27, and Brian Phillips, 25, had already ended. Guests were relaxed, spread out along the beach, talking and checking phones while photographers organized post-ceremony shots. Music played from portable speakers near the reception area. Shoes had been kicked off, jackets were draped over chairs. The setting felt calm and familiar. A photographer suggested moving closer to the water for a final set of photos. The light was flat but usable, and the ocean made a clean background. Nicole and Brian walked toward the shoreline barefoot. From where they stood, the water appeared shallow, barely covering the tops of their feet. A sandbar sat just offshore, creating the impression of a safe, gradual slope. Other guests stood nearby, watching casually. At the time, a single red warning flag was posted along the beach, and it was after 6 p.m., outside regular patrol hours, leaving that section of shoreline without active lifeguard coverage. The couple took a few small steps forward, no more than several feet past the dry sand. The water reached their ankles. Then, without warning, the sand beneath them dropped away. Nicole's footing disappeared first as the seabed fell into a deeper channel. Her wedding dress absorbed water immediately, becoming heavy and pulling downward around her legs. Brian moved toward her, trying to brace her weight and keep balance. As he shifted, the sand gave way under him as well. A rip current, fed by a strong longshore flow, caught both of them at an angle and began pulling them away from shore. The movement was fast and uneven, not straight out, but sideways and outward. At the same time, guests noticed the change when the couple stopped standing upright. Within seconds, waves broke between the shoreline and the sandbar, blocking clear sight lines. Nicole's dress continued to drag her lower, limiting her ability to move her legs. Brian attempted to stay with her, but the current forced them apart. Each wave pushed them farther from where they had entered. Several guests rushed into the water. None were trained for rip current rescue. The surf knocked them off balance, forcing them back toward shore. People shouted and pointed as visual contact was lost behind breaking waves. Within moments, neither Nicole nor Brian could be clearly seen from the beach. Emergency services were called as search efforts began along the shoreline. Responders arrived and coordinated a surface search. Nicole Phillips was recovered first, several hundred yards south of the entry point. Brian Phillips was found shortly afterward, farther along the same current path. Both were transported to a regional medical facility. Resuscitation efforts were attempted and later discontinued. The official cause of death for both individuals was drowning. Investigators confirmed hazardous surf, rip current activity, and shifting sandbars as contributing factors. The incident was ruled an accident. The case was closed. It was an evening reception inside a rented event hall, with round tables arranged across the room. Dinner had ended, plates were cleared, and guests shifted their chairs toward a small raised area near the dance floor where speeches were planned. Soft background music played as a hired DJ adjusted equipment set up beside the platform. The bride's father, Ronald Wise, was 58 years old. He worked a long-time blue-collar job. Family members described him as dependable and practical, and he was closely involved in his daughter's life, often handling responsibilities quietly rather than publicly. He helped pay for part of the wedding and arrived early that day to assist with setup. This was his only daughter, and he was scheduled to speak before the rest of the program continued. The audio setup included a wired microphone, a metal mic stand, a small mixer table, and 2 speakers. Power ran through extension cords that crossed the floor and were partially taped down near the dance area. No ground fault protection was visible on the cords. Earlier in the evening, drinks had been spilled near the dance floor. The area had been wiped, but damp patches remained where condensation and spills had collected. As guests gathered closer for the speeches, phones were raised. The bride and groom took seats near the front. Ronald stepped into position beside the mic stand. The room quieted as the DJ adjusted the volume. A brief audio crackle came through the speakers. One extension cord near the stand appeared slightly loose, but the program continued. Ronald placed one hand on the metal mic stand and pulled the microphone closer. His shoes rested on a damp section of floor near the taped cords. As he began to speak, a fault in the audio system energized the stand. Without proper grounding, electrical current traveled through the metal. Several guests later reported seeing Ronald's body tense suddenly. His hand did not release the stand, and his posture stiffened in place. The electrical current traveled through his hand and chest and exited through the damp floor, completing a circuit. He collapsed beside the microphone stand and did not regain movement. Guests nearest the platform stepped back as the DJ cut power to the sound system. The microphone cable was pulled away, and the speaking area was cleared. Emergency services were called, and paramedics arrived shortly after, moving carefully around the disabled equipment and taped extension cords. The bride ran forward from the front row and reached her father before staff guided her back as responders worked on the floor beside the stand. Despite their efforts, Ronald remained unresponsive. Ronald Wise was pronounced dead at the venue. The cause of death was later determined to be fatal cardiac arrhythmia caused by electrical shock. The reception ended inside the hall. The microphone and metal stand remained unplugged near the spot where he collapsed, the place where he had been scheduled to speak for his daughter, serving as the only speech that night. It was a summer afternoon at a private lakeside rental on Lake Oconee, Georgia, during a small wedding gathering. The heat hung over the water, with temperatures reaching the low 90s degrees Fahrenheit. The lake's surface was calm, reflecting sunlight back toward the shore. Guests gathered near a wooden dock that extended roughly 40 feet into the lake. The dock was being used as the ceremony platform to provide a clean water backdrop for photographs. The bride, Brenna James, was 28 years old. She worked a regular office job. She and her husband, Nick James, age 30, chose a destination-style wedding to keep the event simple and affordable. The guest list was limited to close friends and family. There were no large rented stages or professional seating arrangements. Everything was kept informal. The dock had been built for casual use, not formal events. Several boards showed visible wear, and the support posts were darkened from years of water exposure. The center span sagged slightly underweight. No warning signs were posted, and there were no visible load limit markings. As the ceremony began, guests moved closer to see better and record video. Phones were raised along both sides. Some people stood fully on the dock, while others rested a foot on it from the shoreline. As key moments approached, more guests leaned inward. By the middle of the ceremony, more than 40 people were standing on or partially supported by the dock. Low creaking sounds came from the boards as weight shifted. A few guests adjusted their footing but did not step away. Brenna and Nick stood near the center, close to the officiant. No one paused the ceremony. It continued as planned. During the ring exchange, weight concentrated along the dock's middle span. Without warning, a central support failed. The dock did not break apart cleanly. Instead, it folded inward, pulling boards down toward the water. Several guests later reported hearing a sharp cracking sound, followed by a sudden drop. Phones tilted as people lost balance. At the center of the collapse, Brenna James disappeared downward as the boards gave way beneath her. As the structure failed, her upper body struck a hidden crossbeam and metal bracket left from earlier repairs. The impact was immediate and severe. She did not resurface. Other guests fell into the shallow water and moved quickly toward shore. Nick James resurfaced near the edge of the collapse and was able to move away from the debris, while broken planks floated on the surface. Twisted metal hardware was visible just below the waterline. People hesitated to step back into the water, unsure where it was safe to enter. The water clouded with disturbed silt as the dock settled. Witnesses pointed to where Brenna had gone down near the center of the collapse, but debris blocked access. Nick remained on the shoreline, indicating where she had disappeared, while others tried to move pieces of floating lumber aside. No one could safely reach beneath the collapsed section. Within moments, the surface cleared, and Brenna was no longer visible. The dock shifted slightly and pressed deeper into the lake. Brenna James was later recovered beneath the collapsed portion of the dock. The cause of death was determined to be fatal blunt force trauma caused by the collapse. The wedding ended at the shoreline, with the dock left partially submerged and broken, in the same place where the ceremony had taken place only minutes earlier. It was a late afternoon outdoor wedding held in an open field outside town. A large white rental tent stood over rows of folding chairs and a simple aisle made of flattened grass. The setup was budget-friendly, with minimal decorations and no permanent structures. Wind moved steadily across the field, pushing against the tent fabric and carrying dust from nearby farmland. The groom, Jonas Johnson, was 24 years old. He worked entry-level construction jobs and seasonal labor when work was available. Because money was limited, the wedding was kept small and simple. Planning moved quickly after learning the bride was pregnant. Jonas had handled much of the setup himself that morning, helping place chairs, checking the tent layout, and moving sandbags into position before guests arrived. The bride, Kelsey Parents, was 23 years old and visibly pregnant. The ceremony was informal and focused on family rather than presentation. Several choices were made based on cost and availability, including the tent rental and location. There were no added supports, no flooring, and no wind barriers around the field. The tent measured roughly 40 feet by 60 feet and was anchored with sandbags instead of ground stakes. Each sandbag sat at the base of the tent legs, resting directly on the grass. The tent stood in an open area with no trees or buildings nearby to block wind. Aluminum support poles were set into shallow base plates meant for level ground. Earlier in the day, weather advisories had warned of strong afternoon winds. As the ceremony began, dark clouds gathered in the distance. Guests noticed the tent fabric lifting and settling as gusts passed through. The walls rippled, then dropped back into place. Sandbags shifted slightly across the grass. No one paused the ceremony. Jonas remained near the front of the tent beside the aisle. As the officiant continued, wind speed increased suddenly. A strong gust lifted one side of the tent wall several feet off the ground, snapping the fabric tight. Multiple sandbags slid at the same time, dragged across the grass as the tension in the tent increased. The tent's western edge pulled free, forcing the frame to shift unevenly. A main support pole near the aisle dislodged from its base plate, with nothing securing it to the ground. The 12-foot aluminum pole was lifted and driven sideways by the wind. Several guests later reported seeing the pole swing at head height and strike Jonas Johnson in the head and upper shoulder area as he turned toward the aisle. Jonas collapsed immediately and fell to the ground without moving. Almost at the same moment, the rest of the structure failed. The tent folded inward as fabric dropped over chairs and guests. Sections of the frame bent under pressure, while people pushed through the loose material, pulling themselves free and trying to locate others beneath the canvas. When the tent finally settled, parts of the aluminum frame lay twisted across the grass. Emergency services were called as guests cleared space around Jonas. Paramedics arrived shortly after, moving carefully through the collapsed fabric and fallen poles. Jonas remained unresponsive as he was stabilized and taken from the field. Jonas Johnson died later that evening from fatal blunt head trauma caused by the collapsing tent structure. The wedding did not continue and was never completed. The ceremony ended in the open field where the tent had fallen. Kelsey Paris, pregnant and still in her wedding dress, was taken away from the site by family members, leaving the aisle and the collapsed tent behind. It was October 7th, 2018, when 7-year-old Lena Whitmore, the bride's step-sister, attended what would be her final family celebration at a restored wooden barn in Franklin, Tennessee. The evening conditions were calm, with clear skies, low humidity, and a light breeze moving across the open grounds. The venue featured gravel pathways, winding between decorative hay bales that had been stacked 4 feet high to create rustic seating areas around the ceremony space. Lena was the flower girl for her stepsister's wedding, a role she had practiced for weeks. She lived in a blended household with the bride and had been closely involved in the wedding preparations, including rehearsals and the planned sparklers send-off. During the evening, adult family members were occupied coordinating the 120 guests for the finale celebration, leaving the children gathered near the exit area. The event coordinator had organized the sparkler tunnel using 20-inch metal sparklers, creating a 15-foot pathway for the couple's exit. Despite venue policies prohibiting open flames, supervision had relaxed during the evening's excitement. The decorative hay bales, positioned 3 feet from the pathway's edge, framed the sparkling tunnel perfectly. Lena stood with 2 other children, approximately 8 feet from the tunnel's entrance, waiting for her stepsister's exit, as she had been instructed earlier. The adults nearby were focused on positioning sparklers and capturing photographs, and the children's exact positions were not actively monitored during that moment. As guests prepared their sparklers, one person attempting to relight another sparkler lowered his own too quickly. Burning metal fragments, capable of exceeding 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, scattered onto the ground behind the hay bales. The dry straw ignited within seconds. Fire spread rapidly along the ground through loose straw and dry debris, producing low, rolling smoke that initially blended into the dim lighting and crowd movement. The flames moved quickly through the compressed hay, partially obscured by crowd noise and music, creating a ground-level inferno that went unnoticed for over a minute. When guests finally detected smoke and began backing away from the tunnel, The 15-foot exit path narrowed to approximately 6 feet. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing Lena knocked down during the initial panic as adults rushed toward the single exit route. The child fell behind the hay bales, where flames had already created an area of intense heat and dense smoke. Investigators later determined that fire contact occurred shortly after her fall, while smoke inhalation began immediately in the confined space. Venue staff responded within several minutes, using portable extinguishers to suppress the flames. The fire was contained to a 20-foot radius, but the hay bales had collapsed, creating a 3-foot deep debris field. Lena was located 4 minutes after the initial ignition, found unresponsive beneath collapsed hay bales approximately 12 feet from where witnesses last saw her standing. Emergency responders arrived 8 minutes after the 911 call, but resuscitation attempts were unsuccessful. The wedding ended at the barn, with the sparkler tunnel extinguished and hay bales still smoldering along the pathway. Lena was later confirmed to have died from acute smoke inhalation, with secondary thermal burns sustained during the fire. The planned send-off was never completed, and the bride was escorted away from the grounds without passing through the tunnel prepared for her and her stepsister. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now